There are three people I want to note right now. One is our keynote speaker, Melissa Berman, who will join us in just a moment, and two of our program committee members, one Jack Krauskopf, who's the director for the Center of Nonprofit Management and Strategy here at Baruch, and Richard Brown, who is Vice President of Philanthropy for American Express. I'd like to ask Richard to join me right now. Hi, Richard.
Hi.
Richard is going to introduce our keynote speaker.
Thank you. Good afternoon, folks, or good morning, I should say. As mentioned, I'm VP of Philanthropy at American Express, and we're a proud sponsor of this symposium. And before I introduce Melissa, I just wanted to recognize a colleague of mine, Wendy Lopez, who's sitting in the front. This is her second day at American Express, so we are delighted to have her, and so I wanted to mention her. It is with delight and certainly a pleasure to introduce today's keynote speaker, Melissa Berman. Melissa, as many of you know, is the president and CEO of Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, a position she's held since January of 2001. The Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, or commonly known as RPA, is an innovative nonprofit philanthropy service founded by the Rockefeller family. RPA's mission is to help donors create thoughtful, effective philanthropy throughout the world. RPA develops strategic plans, conducts research, manages foundations and trusts, structures major gifts, coordinates donor collaboratives, and provides re-granting and fiscal sponsorship services. RPA annually manages or facilitates about $200 million in giving to more than 220 countries and has offices in New York, San Francisco, Los Angeles, and Chicago. And in fact, just this past week, I got to meet with one of her colleagues in San Francisco, a young lady who used to work at American Express as an intern, and she's having a fabulous time. She's learning a great deal, and she's become a very conscientious grant maker and advisor in a plum location, I must say. So I think that a lot of that goes to Melissa's leadership. Previously, Melissa served as a senior vice president in research and program development at the Conference Board, where she oversaw all research and publications on management practices, including global corporate citizenship and governance. She is a frequent speaker at a number of different publications and radio and television stations. She has been interviewed on the Today Show, NBC Nightly News, NPR, CNBC TV, and Bloomberg Television. She's also an adjunct professor at Columbia University, where she also serves on the advisory board for the Social Enterprise Program. And just last year, I had the opportunity to work with her and two other funders. We spoke to her students, and they asked us some really pointed questions. So I think Melissa prepped them very well because they seem to know all of our soft spots. Dr. Berman holds a BA from Harvard and a PhD from Stanford University. Please welcome her to the podium.
Hi, good morning, everyone. It's a pleasure to be here. I want to thank the Better Business Bureau for the opportunity. Thank you. And I also want to thank Richard for a very generous introduction. I thought that I would talk to you today about some of what we're seeing at Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors from the viewpoint of the donors we work with and whom you therefore have to work with also. And some of these observations are based on what we're seeing here in the U.S., and some of them are actually based on what we're noticing in our travels outside the U.S. And so I'll talk about three trends, three challenges, and three opportunities. This is because although I do have a doctorate, it's in English, and my undergraduate degree was in folklore, and really I can't count past three. I have yet actually to be convinced that you need any number higher than three. I'm going to skip over what RPA is, because most of you know that, and Richard explained that. I want to mention that in the last few years, we've been publishing a series of donor guides, and we've been able to do this with the very generous support of the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation And so all of these guides are available on our website. You may download and reproduce in unlimited quantities, et cetera. And some of them may provide some helpful insights or way to frame some of the discussions that nonprofits and donors increasingly have. So this entire process, of course, has given us a lot of opportunity in our organization to think really deeply about what it is that philanthropy is now and can do, and what some of the important changes are. So I'm going to talk first about three sort of changes in giving that are a part of the landscape now. I would add that although we are labeling these innovations, I think really many of these trends have occurred before. If you really step back and look at the history of philanthropy over time and in different locations. The first is what's called solutions-based approaches. The second, new ways to fund, and the third, deep involvement. So I'll go through each of those. In terms of solutions-based approaches, I think I want to point out first that I didn't say impact, I didn't say measurement, I didn't say outputs, I didn't say outcomes, I didn't say any of those things. This is the proliferation of vocabulary around this is something of a challenge, but many donors, even donors with relatively modest funds, have become very committed in recent years to solving a problem and not just ameliorating or softening the edges. And I think, in fact, maybe one of the most frequent pieces of advice we end up giving to the donors with whom we work is that you should not fund the problem, you should fund the solution. And what we mean by that, it's very simple and obvious, is that it no longer really suffices for many donors and their goals to have somebody tell them how bad a problem there is, how much worse it's getting, and how intractable it is. That's in many ways an invitation to say, well, why should I bother? But the desire to fund a solution is not simply a matter of saying, I don't want to do charity, I only want to do philanthropy and do root causes, et cetera. We're actually not at RPA big advocates of that distinction. I believe that traditional charitable giving is a very important part of philanthropy. Every major religion on the planet encourages it, and it's insulting and demeaning to people to tell them that they're doing something that is somehow second class. I think it's also a fairly artificial barrier between when people start to talk about things that are just treating the symptoms and not the problem or not the root cause. That is not only in the eye of the beholder, but it's really a much more complex matter than that kind of crass distinction would make us think. If you take that distinction between treating the symptoms and not the root cause of the problem, it means that all of the money that has been donated to support what became insulin therapy has been wasted and is merely charitable giving because it doesn't cure diabetes. It allows people to live a healthy life. So that's a different matter, right? But the desire to help solve a problem is a very powerful one for many funders now. And although it's not in the power of every funder or every organization to single-handedly solve a problem, it is in their power to talk about how they are part of that solution. And it's in their power to talk about how they are part of the larger system under which these problems are flourishing and need to be tackled. For many donors, the idea of systems thinking, looking at a problem not just in isolation, but in its totality, presents both opportunities and challenges in and of itself. Clearly, if you are a believer in early childhood education, and that's where you're funding, it may occur to you at some point that it doesn't do enough good simply to have the best quality early education available to every child if some children are going to school hungry. What tends to trip many donors up as they start to think this way is that, first of all, if you back up far away enough from a problem so that you can see its entire extent, you fall off a cliff. Second, you find yourself in a position in which the size and scope of the system that you're dealing with is much, much larger than any single funder's resources, including the Gates Foundation. And so then you have to figure out how to both broaden your perspective and then narrow it again. And that's not easy to do. But that is, again, something that I think all of the organizations in this room know how to address. The panel that just concluded did a very artful job of clarifying for all of us exactly how complicated it is to, quote, measure, unquote, quote, results, unquote, since we are not able to agree either on what measurement means or even on what results mean. Largely, it's often because we are not actually able to agree on what the problem is that we're trying to solve. So if you cannot define the problem, you're not going to be able to agree on what the solution is. This is a very important problem for us to solve, so to speak, as a community. The desire to have something that they can grab a hold of is extremely important to many donors who often feel like strangers in a strange land when they are interacting with nonprofits and hearing about data from research organizations, since for many of them that's an unfamiliar vocabulary. I think what's really critical to recognize, though, is that measuring results means an enormous variety of different things to different kinds of funders. For some funders, it means the kind of randomized control study that we were talking about earlier. For other funders, it means having some sort of assurance that their money was indeed spent on schools and not on roads. And that's simply what they mean by results. I think the last part of this trend has to do with the idea of looking for leverage. Donors are more interested than at any time I'm aware of in the idea of collaborating and in being willing to think about complex things like public-private partnerships. They are not always meaning the same things when they say leverage. Many of the funders we work with say that they're looking for partners for leverage. What they really mean is that they believe that as soon as other funders hear about their great idea, they will write a large check and ask no questions. They are not so interested in hearing about other people's ideas, though. So a true funder collaboration, as I'm sure all of you know, is an extremely difficult thing to do, but there are signs that more and more funders are willing to act in partnership as they go through this whole process of saying, I want to solve something important, I want to see how the whole system operates, I want to, see results. I can't do it by myself, though, and I think that is that's an important trend for all of us. Second are some of the newer ways to fund or to think about using money. I think the trend toward either what might be called either giving while living or giving with a defined endpoint is a very important one for all of us also. In addition to the well-known examples of folks like Chuck Feeney and Charles Bronfman, who have all arranged their philanthropic programs so that they will be out of the business of giving money during their lifetimes. There are many more funders who are defining the endpoint of their foundation or their charitable giving initiative. The Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation has decided that they will have granted out all of their money, including Warren Buffett's money, by 25 years after the death of the last of the current trustees of the foundation. The youngest of those trustees is Melinda Gates, who's in, I think, her early, maybe mid-50s, assuming luck and medical advances that suggests that nonetheless 75 years from now there is no longer a Gates Foundation. This grows out of a number of factors. Some of it has to do with the idea of control. There are many donors who feel that they have a particular passion and level of commitment that they don't think that other people who come after them will have, they therefore want to be sure that their resources, as they continue to think of it, are used in the ways that they want to. For other people, it's a conviction that's born of a sense that the problem that they are tackling is going to benefit more from intense levels of funding in a shorter period of time rather than a steady stream of funding over over a potentially infinite amount of time. I think this is particularly true and a particularly good case for funders who are concerned with climate change, who make the argument, despite the snow in North Carolina, that if we don't do something over the relatively short term, the problems that we'll have to deal with in the long term will be 10 times as expensive. In other cases, though, it's hard to see what is going to step into the philanthropic void that may be left when some large funders leave the field. So this is decidedly a mixed blessing, but the data from the Foundation Center really indicate that there are more and more foundations that are defining an endpoint or declaring that they have not made a decision yet about it, as opposed to assuming from the very beginning that all foundations are supposed to exist in perpetuity. Second is impact investing, which is a field in which there are, again, as many vocabulary words as actual funds to invest in. But the hope here is that, especially for endowed foundations, that there is a way to use the 95% of the funding that sits in the endowment to help move the mission along and to move it along in a sustainable way by getting at least some return on capital. So impact investing would cover any form of investing in which you are getting both a financial return and a social or environmental return. And you may be sacrificing an enormous amount of market return based on the asset class you're talking about, or you may actually be hoping to get a return above traditional market rates. This is a field that has an enormous amount of attention. It clearly is extremely attractive to people who come out of the business sector, and it is a field in which many organizations, especially the ones whose results are harder to measure, arts, leadership, community development, human rights, et cetera, feel greatly disadvantaged. And in fact, I was asked a question recently by somebody from who represents a lot of nonprofits in the development space about how nonprofits can deal with the sort of fashion for impact investing at the expense potentially of traditional grant making. What's interesting about this question is that I was asked it in Beijing. And that gives you a sense of how powerfully this idea is moving around the world. And I think it's something, again, that we all have to think about and talk about. I think social enterprise is another area that many donors are very interested in. They're interested in underwriting small business-like organizations, some structured as for-profit, some as nonprofit, and they see that as a way to try and get market forces to deal with a complex problem and to deal with it in a way that may be more sustainable than a stream of perpetual funding. And then finally, advocacy and communications. This is not new, obviously. This has been going on for quite some time now. But we feel that a much broader range of funders than usual has begun to recognize how important this is to achieving their goals, and that they are much more open to this kind of approach than ever before. The third trend that we're seeing is deep involvement. And obviously this is connected both with the desire to really solve a problem, the desire to figure out new ways to use funding, but many donors, and I'm speaking here in particular of private donors, not just institutional donors, are getting involved in philanthropy much, much earlier in their lives. They don't simply put this off until after retirement or their estates. They want to have an understanding of the issue that they are funding in, so they want to have research, although what they mean by research and a social scientist means by research may not exactly always be the same thing. They want to be deeply and personally involved, knowledgeable about the issue, able to communicate about it. They're looking for leaders to fund, and they want to be putting in more than money, and they want to be working with partners. And all of these things, I think, really are basically very good news for our sector. This leaves us with three challenges, which I don't want to say too much about because, you know, it's really not as much fun to think about as opportunities. And we've talked about them, you know, over the course of this event in many ways. First is the whole idea of what is it that we mean by assessing results. No one has really, I think, successfully cracked the code on this in very broad ways yet. I think there's an enormous amount of wonderful work underway, but I would say that as a field, we could do some work in communicating more consistently what all of us mean by some of these words. I don't know what the mechanism might be for those of us in the nonprofit sector to start to use some common vocabulary about this, but we are puzzling our funders when we correct them, or when they say results and we say, no, you mean outcomes, or they say outcomes and we say, no, you mean impacts. This is, we got to figure this out somehow. And I think we have to be honest about what we can do and what we can't do in this field, and start to try and manage expectations. And second is the whole idea of taking solutions to scale. The four organizations represented here, all of them working hard to think about this, as are many of the organizations in this room. Bob Ross, the CEO of the California Endowment, just published a piece, a thought piece that I encourage all of you to take a look at in the Stanford Social Innovation Review, in which he said, we have to stop talking about innovation and start talking about scale. And that he feels there is too much attention on the novel for its own sake. Innovative is not a synonym for effective. And that the real challenge all of us face is, okay, we've shown how something works in some population group or in some region, et cetera. How does that turn into something that can really be apply to a population as a whole? And then the third challenge that we have is fragmentation. And I actually don't just mean fragmentation among fund-seeking organizations. I'm really talking more about fragmentation among the donor community. If you ask me why there are so many nonprofits, my answer is because there are so many funders. And otherwise, if there weren't so many funders all willing to support so many nonprofits, there would be more nonprofits going under, and we wouldn't see instead the growth that we've seen in the nonprofit sector over the last couple of decades. It is very tempting in our sector for reasons that are, I think, obvious to all of us, for not only every nonprofit to say what we do is unique, but for every funder to say what I do is unique and how I think is unique and my approach is unique. And there are no barriers to that. Philanthropy is voluntary. There is nothing that to keep a funder from wanting to do things differently from any other person. And I don't think that we would, by and large, want to impose a kind of regulatory framework that would say to a funder, you can only go this far, and after that you got to check with somebody. Nor would we want to say that we're going to have some outside organization decide which nonprofits are, quote, good and not good. The idea of how quickly that could be politicized is pretty terrifying. And the same would be true of the idea of how to regulate funders. Once somebody tells you, how much money you're supposed to give and where it's supposed to go, this is a tax. This is not philanthropy. So I think we are stuck with this problem for all time. But what we can do something about is the amount of information and the clarity of the information that we are able to marshal to talk about our organizations in a broader context and to communicate how it is that we can and do work with one another. And that's, I think, really important. And finally, I want to wrap up with just 3 opportunities that I see as very powerful right now. First, I think that as a result of funders beginning to understand that they don't just want to be donating money at arm's length, but they want to be part of solving a problem, and as a result of them diving deeper, they are gaining a better understanding of how the charitable sector works and are much more amenable to understanding that nonprofits, like any other organization, have legitimate operating costs. And I believe that if we could stop using the word overhead and start talking about operating costs, we could do a whole lot more to reinforce that point of view. Several notable organizations have taken very public stands on this, and I think that we do have the opportunity over the next decade to try and lay this dragon to rest. It is true that efficiency is important, but more and more donors recognize that efficiency and effectiveness are 2 different things. and that you, just because you have one does not mean you have the other. Clearly, there are still going to be scandals in our field that interfere with the level of trust that our system needs. But we have a much higher level of trust here in the U.S. than in the nonprofit sector than in almost any place I visit. I mentioned Beijing because that's where I was last week. In China, there was a huge scandal with the China Red Cross involving an employee of the Red Cross bragging online about her Lamborghini, which was really not very smart. And, you know, in the U.S., as some of us recall, there was a big scandal about the American Red Cross a couple decades ago, involving somebody bragging about his country club memberships, et cetera, right? But charitable giving in the U.S. did not dip as a result overall as a result of that scandal. And in fact, giving to the Red Cross dipped for only a very brief period of time. In China, the overall level, measurable level of charitable giving to all organizations in the whole country dipped significantly after that one scandal. And that's because the level of trust in the nonprofit sector there is nowhere near as high as it is here. And that's an asset of ours that we really can build on. I think second, all of us have an opportunity to step out of our silos more now than ever. As donors want to talk to us about how we're solving problems, it gives us a way of saying, well, sure, we're an early childhood education organization, but we understand a lot about nutrition, and here are some resources on this issue, and we can start to build the kinds of relationships and opportunities that maybe weren't possible in the sort of last year of philanthropy, in which the mantra was focus, 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 focus. I think now the idea of look at the whole system is a big advantage to us. And then finally, in terms of seizing the moment, I mean, not only do we in this country have a historic level of trust in the nonprofit sector, but we're in a period of time in which there is a great deal of confidence in non-traditional solutions. The flip side of the frustration with the government sector is that the nonprofit sector rises in everyone's regard during those times. And I think around the world, but particularly here in the U.S., there is a growing recognition that income inequality is a problem that has to be solved, and there are people on opposite sides of the spectrum who believe that. And there is, therefore, something of a consensus emerging that we have serious issues that have to be dealt with, and that the nonprofit sector is a source of innovation and solution, and that's something that we should all feel great about. So I thank you very much for the opportunity to speak with you this morning, and I'd be happy to deal with questions, comments. No math problems, please. Let me just sit down, sure.
So here's some questions. I haven't had a chance to read these yet, so I'm going to do it straight off, and I assume there may be some more coming. Melissa certainly opened up all kinds of avenues for discussion. How does one get support for an unpopular non-PC cause, i.e. programs for men and boys? Our boys are failing in school, 6 out of 8 children on AHDD, etc.
Right. Well, in terms of the issue of men and boys, I think actually there's a phenomenal amount of attention and resources that are starting to go into that, starting from the attention that the White House has put on the issue to a coalition of major foundations. But in terms of issues that are not as popular, I think unfortunately the traditional methods work best. Find a few champions, figure out who those champions know. I think that connecting your cause to a broader set of issues can also be an extremely important strategy now.
So here's a related question, maybe slightly controversial, but I'll read it the way it was asked. When soliciting funds for projects for men and boys, how does one get past the female gatekeepers who see aid for males as non-PC?
It is the nonprofit and philanthropic sector does have probably a higher proportion of female leaders than some other sectors, although, you know, from the perspective of some women, still actually, I wouldn't say the top 25, 30 foundations in the U.S. are predominantly female-led. But I think that any rational person recognizes that you just as you can't ignore the 50% of the population that's female, you can't ignore the 50% of the population that's male, and that it's certainly a problem for women if men and boys are failing. So,
I'll ask a question based on your last point in the China example, which is why you think the nonprofit sector in the U.S. Has more trust based in it than in some other countries, and then just connected to that, is it really different than the way the public views the public sector, which is such an important funder as well as philanthropy for what the nonprofit sector does?
I think in the U.S. we have a high degree of trust in the nonprofit sector because this has really been part of the fabric of at least the of American society since the arrival of Europeans. Many of those Europeans were fleeing governments that they didn't trust, that they felt repressed by, and they developed a set of institutions that, you know, as we all remember from high school, de Tocqueville observed very, very early on in our history as, you know, voluntary, independent of government, citizen-led, et cetera. I think that as a nation, we have had less faith in the public sector than many other nations around the world for a very long time. I think having not distrust, maybe mixed feelings about the public sector is a very deep thing in this country and is very, very different in other places around the world. China doesn't have a pervasive government sector just because of the communist revolution. China had powerful, powerful central government for many, 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 many centuries. And so the idea that government is the solution and the prime mover is a very old idea there.
But is that also true in the U.S. where government and the nonprofit sector are so intertwined, especially in service delivery? New York City being an example, and
sure.
I suspect
many
of the organizations in this room.
I think that one of the things, I think that funders who have a lot of experience and who people like Richard Brown and his colleagues at Amex, people, you know, at places like Atlantic, Ford Foundation, et cetera, understand very well the relationship between the nonprofit sector and the public sector. But I can tell you when we speak to people who are relatively new to philanthropy or who are kind of thinking about it seriously for the first time, they are often flabbergasted to know how much of nonprofit funding comes from the public sector. Or from government contracts, or from fee for service. They are stunned. They don't understand necessarily how entwined these two parts of our society are.
A question about collaboration, which is a theme through all the panels and discussion this morning. Are individual donors engaging in collaborations or collective impact projects as foundations are doing?
There are some individual donors who are engaging in collaborations. Many of those are through community foundations, for example, which the Fairfield County Community Foundation has some programs, for example, that many community members participate in, and this allows people with relatively modest means as well as very significant funders to be part of a collaborative. There are giving circles in many communities, and then there are informal networks that slowly move toward pooling their funding. It's not an easy thing, but it does, but it can happen, and I believe it happens more and more.
So are donors of wealth starting to work and strategize more in concert with government agencies?
Some donors with extremely high levels of wealth are, because they recognize very clearly where the big dollars are. At the end of the day, the Gates Foundation can't really advance its agendas in global health or education or global development without the cooperation of various governments as well as other kinds of multilateral funders. Clearly, this is an important strategy for donors like Michael Bloomberg and many other major donors. Both donors on the right and the left have begun to recognize that funding advocacy type organizations in the wake of the Citizens United is also a way to think about having influence through government. We know that those are not technically charitable donations, but in the mind of many donors, that distinction is really not very important. It's they're giving money to create social change, and it doesn't matter so much whether it's deductible or not.
That probably sounds ironic to a lot of us in this room.
Yeah.
What advice would you give a young person just starting out to work in philanthropy?
I think that it's important to get a sound understanding of how the nonprofit sector functions by working in a nonprofit. I think understanding how public funding works is also important. And I know it sounds trite, and I apologize in advance, but do work that reflects your values and your passions. I think without that kind of commitment, it's a long, hard, cold road.
So here's a question that you didn't answer deliberately at the beginning. What are the key areas of focus for RPA, Rockefeller Philanthropy Advisors, and its clients in New York City, elsewhere now and in the future?
So our mission is to help donors create thoughtful, effective philanthropy throughout the world, and we meet donors where they are. It's not our job to tell them what they're supposed to fund or how to fund it within some reasons. So for example, if a donor comes in and says, I'd like to fund in community health clinics, but I don't want to fund any overhead, we would say, you can't do that. You can't do that. However, it's not our job to tell that person, no, you should fund research instead, or no, you should fund climate change, or no, you should fund early childhood. So we work in a very diverse array of issues. Probably as a result of the Rockefeller heritage, we see a disproportionate number of funders who are interested in global issues, as well as a disproportionate number of funders interested in the environment. But we're doing work with donors in virtually every issue area all across the U.S. and in 20-something countries.
Speaking of global issues, what is the future of funding that encourages international cooperation, even for smaller nonprofit and arts organizations?
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting and challenging question. International arts organizations are not having a great time of it right now. International cooperation organizations are also under a lot of pressure. There's a great deal of pessimism about that. I think that anything that these organizations can do to connect their work to reducing income inequality, poverty alleviation, human rights, those issues, I think, resonate.
I haven't heard anything said today about the older worker and the boomers needing and looking for work. Companies are beginning to change their programs in the workforce.
And really a good thing, too, from my perspective. But I think that, so do you think this is about boomers needing work? Or?
I think I would interpret the first sentence in the question to be what should be done about older workers who need to look for work.
I think in my former life when I was at the conference board, going back at least 15 years ago, large companies began to recognize that pushing baby boomers out was really dumb because the numbers were very, very straightforward, even for those who were liberal arts majors like me. The next wave in the workforce is not large enough. In addition, they were getting rid of vast amounts of organizational knowledge and history. So I think most very large companies have a very different point of view now. I think smaller companies probably continue to see things from the prism of the increasing cost of healthcare, and until we can figure out how to solve that problem, that is going to make smaller companies more reluctant to bring on older workers, fair or not fair, fact or no fact. That's just a reality. It is, however, a great opportunity for the nonprofit sector.
Those are all the questions, and I think the time is exactly at closing. And
that's right. Well, thank you so much. I just want to say I am so happy that each and every one of you, as well as some of the folks who have left already, were here today to hear this incredible dialogue that's gone on between all of you, whether you were speaking or not, you were part of the dialogue, and our panelists and leaders like Melissa Berman. Thank you, Jack, for leading this session in questions and answers. There are two dates that I would love you to mark down. One is April 8th, where we're going to offer a workshop about budgeting. It's generously sponsored and presented by Hilda Polanco of Fiscal Management Associates. And May 7th, Internal Controls. It's a workshop generously sponsored and presented by Julie Flock and Candace Meth of Eisner-Amper. Those two programs are also part of this overall program, what we call the Charity Symposium. There's so much to talk about. We only have a half a day. Thank you for mentioning the overhead myth. That was BBB, Charity Navigator, and GuideStar. It is a very hot topic, continues to boil over. Again, thank you so much. Thanks for being part of today. Thank you, Melissa. Thank you, Jack. And thank all of our panel, David, Birdsell, Baruch. I could go on and on, American Express. Thank you, and we'll see you at the next one. And don't forget to write out your evaluations and give them to the folks outside. We really read them. Thank you.